Good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. We're a bit this side heavy, aren't we? Does it feel like we're listing that way? Really good to have you here for our second in our Faith in Context series, and really good to welcome back Dr. Chloe Redaway, and you'll be helping us encounter the Bible through art, I think. Good. Very exciting. Unfortunately, I can't stay tonight, but I will be watching online from home, so you better be behaving yourselves. I will notice. I will be leaving you in the capable hands of my beautiful assistant, Darren, who will be managing sound and all the rest of it. And he will also be providing refreshments in the interval. So please do grab yourself wine or coffee from the porch room when we get to that point. I think other than that, just to remind you, this is a fundraiser for our organ refurbishment, which we're just signing contracts on at the moment to start work next year, and also the refurbishment of our windows before they fall out, and also to make them look more beautiful when they have been cleaned. So please do give generously and do drink generously. Yes.
If we're no longer using cash, we've got too much else and other things like around us. Can we use that kind of machine?
You please do use the. Certainly I can ask John Judson can look at what date it's gone through, and we can say everything on this date should go there. So if you would rather give my card, please do so at the Just Giving machine on your left, at the back.
It does Apple Pay,
it certainly works with my Android Pay, so I'm sure it works with your posh Apple Pay. I think that's enough from me. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you very much. Does everybody have a copy of the Bible texts that was at the back? No, some people don't. Howard, can we grab a few of those? We've already had the internet die on us once this evening, so if the screen suddenly disappears, please shout, wave, tell me that that's what's happened. And if anybody would like to come further forward, you will see better. There are going to be lots of pictures. No? Okay. Darren, is it possible to take the light stand slightly at the front? Thank you. Yeah,
that's probably what we're doing.
Is that better on the microphone? No. Yes? Okay. For those who are not on Luke, can you hear me? I'm hearing a big echo. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Many of you know me from church anyway, and I met some people at the last Faith in Context talk, so if you've come back for more, congratulations. For those of you who don't know, this does sound very echoey. Darren? Sorry, Darren? The microphone seems to be echoing a lot at this end. Is it just me hearing it? Okay, okay, I'll stop worrying about it, sorry. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a researcher and lecturer at King's College London in the Theology and Religious Studies department in a research centre for arts and the sacred. And I work particularly with theology and the visual arts. I've been at King's for a long time in one guise or another, but I did spend a wonderful 3 years at the National Gallery in London, as their fellow in art and religion. And I think they are still the only museum in the world that has a fellowship in art and religion. And when you think of how much Christian art is in museums and galleries, that seems like a bit of a gap in the curatorial market. But I'm not an art historian, and I always feel I need to say that for the sake of the art historians who would be horrified by the kinds of work that I do. I do work with art historians and curators, and also with theologians and biblical scholars and artists and many others. And one of the projects that I work on at King's is the one I'd like to talk to you about this evening, which is the visual commentary on Scripture. This was a project that was started in 2018. We'd been thinking about it for about a year before that. And it is a free, completely accessible online publication providing theological commentary in dialogue with works of art and looking at, eventually, the entire text of the Bible. We haven't quite got there yet, but we will eventually. Each section of the visual commentary on Scripture is structured as a virtual exhibition, a mini exhibition with 3 artworks. So there is a passage of Scripture, the 3 artworks that have been chosen in relation to that passage, a short commentary for each one, and then a longer commentary that brings them all together. So to give you an example, this is our home page, and you can search by books of the Bible or by types of thing on the website, by video or by other special features. And I'll show you more of those in a moment, but I wanted to give you just an example of the look of an exhibition. So this is an exhibition that was curated by a theologian from the university in Malawi, and it's looking at a passage from Luke chapter 2, verses 34 to 35. It's a very short passage. This is the landing page, if you like, for the exhibition. And you can see there are the 3 artworks along the top like that, and the biblical text below. It's a very brief one. When you enter the exhibition, or when you click on any of those images, you get a very high resolution, zoomable image, which you can click on and come really very close into. Sometimes the images on the website allow you to see things that would actually be quite hard to see in real life in front of that object in a museum. It might be behind glass, there might be a degree of reflection, it might be in an awkward corner, the light might not be good enough. These images almost always allow you to get really, really close in. You can spend as long as you want, obviously, looking at the image, playing around with it, and then you can read the commentary. Or in many cases, you can listen to the commentary, because increasingly we're trying to record them so that you can just look at the picture and hear the words. And it's just a short commentary for the individual image. You can then move on to the next image, and the same thing, you can zoom right in. This one is a wonderful, wonderful close-up. You can get right into those 2 faces next to each other. I've found a number of the artworks on the website are things that I think I know relatively well. And then I look at them in that degree of magnification and I start to see things that I hadn't noticed before. Again, you can read or listen to the commentary and move on to the 3rd image. This is a wonderful African Pieta by an artist from Nairobi called Engelbert Mveng. Not an image that it's easy to actually go and see because it's in situ in a chapel in Nairobi, and not an image that it's particularly easy to find online. It's not published very much. I think it pops up on Pinterest in a couple of places. I don't know if anybody uses Pinterest, but I find it the most frustrating thing because you get a little image that you get no information about and you can't get any closer to. And then when you've looked at all three, you can go into the comparative commentary, as we call it, which is bringing all three of the artworks together with the biblical text. At any point, if you want to see the biblical text, you can just bring up an overlay that will remind you of what you were reading. And the longer commentary brings them all together and provides a slightly more in-depth analysis with those artworks in conversation with the text. So that's how an individual exhibition works. We commission a curator, if you like, for each exhibition. And our curators are theologians and biblical scholars, ministers, church historians, curators and gallery managers, artists. We've had a couple of poets. So quite a range of people. And we'll discuss with that person what passage in Scripture they might like to curate and what three artworks they think will open up that particular biblical text and allow them to find new perspectives on that passage. And they then write their commentaries and explain and interpret the relationships which they see between the artworks and the text. As an academic project, we are combining three disciplines. So the VCS is essentially a theological project, but it is responsibly informed by biblical studies and by art history. And that's something that many of our curators find difficult, demanding, because not many people are fluent in all three of those disciplines. So sometimes there is quite an intensive editorial process in working through that. And the results can be very exciting because it is like a three-way conversation between those disciplines, as well as a conversation between the artworks and the passage. And I think that conversational model explains best what we're trying to do, which is certainly not to say, here is a pinned down, definitive meaning. This is what this picture means, or this sculpture means. This is what this passage means. It is to open up a conversation between the text and the wider world through the art. And the aim of each exhibition, as well as the project as a whole, is to help people discover and rediscover the Bible in new ways, in surprising ways, perhaps in epiphanic or transformative ways, through that interaction of text and artwork and commentary. And ideally, a VCS exhibition should mean that one never reads that biblical passage in the same way again, or looks at those artworks in the same way again. Our curators and the artworks that they choose vary hugely. We have a range of authors from the curator of the Israel Museum in Tel Aviv, to a biblical scholar in South Africa, to an art historian at Yale. The majority of the authors are still primarily English-speaking and university-based, but increasingly we're managing to attract people from a much wider range of universities and museums and churches and arts institutions. And our artworks are even more varied. There are plenty of what you might think of as the usual suspects. So there are lots of illuminated manuscripts and Blake etchings and Michelangelo's. But there are also objects from as early as the 7th century BC, and I just wanted to show you this one because I think it's one of the most beautiful things that we have. This is a series of handprints from a cave in Argentina. I will just put it up. Here we are. Which dates back to 7000 BCE. 7000 BCE. think it's completely extraordinary to imagine people's hands in paint on a cave wall that long ago. And that is, and always will be, our oldest work of art on the site. Our most recent one is a new canvas that was just installed in a church in Princeton recently. It was finished earlier this year, and it's a very abstract work using a particular kind of mineral paint to make this very finely detailed abstract blue. Very traditional in some ways and completely untraditional in others. And the span ranges between those two. We have metalwork, we have video installations, we have textiles and early photography and ceramics and sculpture and a lot of paintings and drawings. To date, we've got 285 of these little exhibitions online. We've got about 150 in the pipeline at the moment, and eventually we will have something like 1,200. So we've got a fairly long way to go, but we also have a substantial body of material now. We also obviously have a leviathan of a record maintenance system to keep all of this information, and an image researcher who is constantly tracking down complicated image rights for us. And our users are academics and students and curators, but also clergy and church groups, and increasingly anybody and everybody with an interest, because the more material that we have, the more people are finding it, and the more we come across, user hits on the website from places where we think, oh, how did somebody there know about it? It's quite exciting to see how the use is spreading in that respect. Within the website, there are quite a lot of ways that one can use it, the simplest of which is simply to search by book of the Bible. So if you go into the Old Testament and Apocrypha section, you get a list of all the books and how many exhibitions there are for each one. And you can open that. Suppose I want to see something in 1 Samuel. I can go here and I'll find that there's an exhibition about the anointing of David, and something about David and Saul and music, and another about David and Goliath, and the Witch of Endor. And sometimes you'll see that there are 2 passages, so where the same story is told in 2 books, this happens a lot, of course, with the Gospels, but sometimes between, say, Samuel and Chronicles, or with the books of Kings, then those 2 passages will both come up. You could search for it from either direction. If I want to see what there is in Genesis, well, we've got a lot of exhibitions in Genesis. Again, you have this sort of river of images to scroll down and choose from. And sometimes they will be artworks that seem very expected, and at other times they might seem quite surprising. Here's a Damien Hirst on the left-hand side. In the same way, one can search through the New Testament books. We're doing fairly well on the Gospels. Of course, with the Synoptics, and even sometimes with John, one exhibition can cover 3 or 4 passages. We're working hard on the Pauline epistles. It's quite difficult to write an exhibition like this about something which is not per se a story. And that applies to things like the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and indeed to some of the history where there aren't necessarily lots of illustrations of it. If you want to talk about creation, it's easy. There are hundreds and thousands of artworks that one could pick that are obviously to do with creation. But if you want to write about the Epistle to the Colossians, you have to think a little bit more laterally. And I will give you an example in a minute of some of the ways in which that kind of lateral thinking can happen. If you don't want to search by book, and you're interested in something else, You can explore by, well, you can look for particular authors if you're interested, but you can also explore by themes. And this is a way that I think lots of our users come to find particular exhibitions. So supposing you want to find something on biblical women, well, you can take your pick. We've got Lot's wife, Hagar, Tamar, Miriam, the Shulamite, Mary and Elizabeth. That's a very big theme. We've got a lot in that category. Similarly, if you wanted to see, oops, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Don't do that. No, go away. Come back, thank you. If you wanted to see something on miracles, you could search by miracles, and again, you will get a whole river of suggestions. Increasingly, we're finding other ways for people to engage with the website content, and sometimes that's through videos. So we have a number of video exhibitions where instead of having the 3 artworks and the written commentaries, you'll have the curator talking about the 3 artworks. And we're increasingly doing museum collaborations. So some of my colleagues have been making films with the Bode Gallery and the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin, using objects in their collections to talk about the life of Jesus and the life of Mary as depicted in art. And we can find them here, for instance. You can see there's a series of short films, and you can choose whether you want to look at something on the Annunciation or the baptism, and so on. We make a lot of resources for church study groups. We do special things for Advent, like an Advent calendar, or reading programs for Lent. So there are a number of ways to come into it. I'm going to show you briefly 2 more exhibitions to give you a sense of some of the range of things that we have. And then I thought we'd look in more depth at 2 particular exhibitions. So I've already shown you the 3 images of the Pietà by the theologian from Malawi, Martin Ott. And here is an exhibition by a biblical scholar from America, looking at the Beatitudes. I'll just wait for that to load. So this is by Rebecca Eklund, who is at Loyola University in the States. And she's looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. And she's chosen a medieval manuscript with the virtues and the vices. So this is from the late 13th century. So if I can zoom in a bit more on that one. You see the trees that are growing with the virtues coming out at the top of this illumination. And then an image that many people will know from the Ghent altarpiece by the Van Eyck brothers. So mid-15th century, the adoration of the mystic lamb. You can see there. And her final choice is a contemporary African-American artist called Laura James. And this piece is called A Sermon for Our Ancestors. It was made in 2006. It's a very modern work. It's on acrylic, but it's using a lot of traditional styles. And she is working with the idea of the Beatitudes as a way of thinking about slavery in America. For something very different, here is an exhibition by an art historian called Stefania Gervini. And she is looking at the passage just after Noah's flood and the ark, Genesis 8 through into 9. And she's chosen this wonderful mosaic from San Marco in Venice. Everybody's come out of the ark and are busy getting back onto land, and you can see the animals finding their way around and running again. This wonderful lion, of course, a symbol in Venice, St. Mark's lion, leaping forwards. Our next piece is actually the frescoed ceiling on the inside of a dome in a church in Milan, which is painted to look rather like a rainbow. going into that central apex of the dome. This is all fresco work. It looks like mini tiles or like feathers. It's just painted very illusionistically. And her final one is another church space. This is also a chapel in Milan, but it's a light installation by the contemporary artist Dan Flavin. And it changes colour during the day, so this space gets completely saturated with different coloured light at different times. I hope that gives you some sense of how the website works and the kind of range of things that you can find on it. What I thought we would do now is, having taken a kind of overview of it, look at an exhibition from the inside out rather than just skating over the top of it. And you've got two Bible passages on your printout, the first of which is a passage from Ecclesiastes. And I wrote an exhibition for this a couple of years ago, and it was one of the instances in which I found myself thinking, how do I deal with a passage where there is no obvious narrative, illustrative object to go for? Ecclesiastes is not a book of the Bible that gets illustrated. You can't walk into the National Gallery or the Vatican and say, I'd like to see the pictures of Ecclesiastes, please, because it's not that kind of a book. There's not much of a story to it. And so I had to look and think more laterally about the themes within that book and what the author of Ecclesiastes, who's known as Kohelet, was thinking about, and which other artists might have been thinking in similar ways. So I'm going to read you the passage from Ecclesiastes, because when one is starting with one of these exhibitions, you can go in any way you like. You can look at the pictures first, you can read the commentaries, you can start with the scripture. But if we were doing something like this as a study group, I would always say we start with the biblical passage, because that's where the curator will have started. So this is from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12, through to chapter 2, verse 26. And we're using the Revised Standard Version translation, which is largely a matter of licensing and what was most accessible. Eventually, one day, we hope that we might be able to flick between different translations within the website, but that seems to be quite a long way off at the moment. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the sons of men to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. I said to myself, come now, I will make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my mind how to cheer my body with wine, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, man's delight. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that one fate comes to all of them. Then I said to myself, what befalls the fool will befall me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said to myself that this also is vanity. For of the wise man as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten, how the wise man dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the men who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a man who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all to be enjoyed by a man who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and strain with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of pain, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his mind does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or who have enjoyment? For to the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and heaping, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. So it's a long passage, and it's quite a difficult passage, and it's not the world's most cheerful passage, and it's certainly not a passage which is readily illustrated. So I spent quite a lot of time thinking about this and thinking, how do we deal with that? How does that relate to something artistic? How have artists found ways of expressing these ideas? Because Ecclesiastes is the book of a philosopher, of somebody trying to understand the meaning of life. And although we tend to think of it as occasionally somewhat nihilist, it is also full of the questions that humans through the centuries, and artists in particular, have been asking. And these are the pictures that I chose. We begin with a painting from the early 1700s by an Italian artist of no great fame called Bartolomeo Bimbi. And what you're looking at is a painting of specimen citrus fruit. You will see that they are all different varieties. They all look slightly different, and they're numbered. And at the bottom, there is a key so that you can read which variety is which. Here, for instance, is the lemon of paradise, limone di paradiso. And we can find it, it's number 19. If we go up, we'll be able to identify it. And it's rather a beautiful one because it's been cut open. You can see the whole fruit and also what it looks like inside. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, from verses 4 to 8, Kohelet, who is the author of Ecclesiastes, describes how he built houses and created gardens and parks filled with fruit trees, with pools to water them. He also acquired slaves and animals, treasure, singers, concubines, and so on. This royal environment echoes very much the palaces of great Middle Eastern kings, with vast botanical gardens and complex irrigation systems. These were both pleasure gardens for private enjoyment and a public statement by a ruler of their wealth and power. And like Kohelet, powerful European rulers in the Renaissance built lavish gardens and filled them with rare plants. The Medici dynasty, for instance, in Florence, amassed a huge collection of citrus fruit trees, including hundreds of specimens of oranges and lemons and citrons, and learned to grow these exotic species through what I can really only describe as extensive horticultural experiments. They were finding out how to treat these plants in an environment in which they were not native. Gardens like those at the Medici-owned Pitti Palace in Florence were both a display of wealth and taste, and also a reflection of their scholarly humanist interest in philosophy and science. These very expensive citrus plants required skilled care by trained gardeners and extra precaution in the winter months when they would all be moved into special lemon houses. And a basket of the specimen fruit was sent annually as a gift to the Pope, and particularly the unusual forms of citrus fruit were prized as bizzarie, or curiosities. The many varieties were then recorded and celebrated in paintings like this one and in plaster and wax casts, many of which still survive. Gardens may be an attempt to recreate paradise on Earth. They can represent scientific curiosity, or they may be, as Kohelet's gardens were, part of an investigation into the value of pleasure and the nature of the good life. Kohelet concluded that there was pleasure to be found in creating such magnificence, but that nevertheless, all these achievements were ultimately nothing but vanity and a striving after wind. And that phrase, of course, comes back again and again in Ecclesiastes. Our next image is a large painting by Paul Gauguin, which now hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It was made in the late 1800s, and it's about 1.5 meters high by 3.5 meters wide. So this is a large piece. It's one of the ones where we can zoom in very close, but it's quite hard to get all of it on the screen in detail, so we will go through it. Paul Gauguin was brought up as a Roman Catholic, but he was later severely critical of the Catholic Church, and his art increasingly reflected a very eclectic philosophy of life. Like our author of Ecclesiastes, Gauguin sought to understand the meaning of existence, and he used painting as a way of exploring his ideas. This work is called Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going To? And it's a testament to this personal search for meaning. Although Gauguin resisted attempts to read this work in allegorical or symbolic terms, he did describe it to friends in letters that he wrote as expressing the cycle of birth, death, life as a whole. And he explained the significance in his eyes of some of its elements. So the central standing figure here, reaching up for the fruit above, indicates for Gauguin the human passage from the innocence of Eden to an adult knowledge. And there is also a sleeping baby on the right who likewise represents that innocence. In the background, there are two figures here who are walking and talking. And Gauguin said that they were standing next to the tree of knowledge or science and confiding their thoughts to each other and expressing the sorrow which knowledge had caused them. There's also this crouching figure next to them with an arm raised, whom Gauguin said was staring in amazement at the audacity of this pair who are daring to contemplate their destiny and trying to understand the world around them. Of course, in Ecclesiastes, we read Kohelet saying, "In much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." That's chapter 1, verse 18. On the left-hand side of the canvas, there's an old lady. Here she is. For Gauguin, she had reached a state of acceptance and resignation as she approached death. And this semi-nude young woman next to her is touching her shadow with one hand, perhaps suggesting that she knows that she too is heading in that direction. Behind them, there's this extraordinary grey-blue idol, whom for Gauguin represented the unknowable beyond, what he called l'au-delà. And in the far corner, you may have noticed there's this strange white bird. It's actually clutching a lizard, which you can't see terribly clearly there, but this green creature is a lizard. And again, for Gauguin, that signified the futility of words. So this is Gauguin trying to understand life through painting, through a circle of meaning in life, of changes and transitions. And as Kohelet suggests, he finds that knowledge brings sorrow, that death comes to everybody, and that there is a mystery to existence which is beyond human understanding. The third image for this exhibition is a silkscreen from Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series. It was made in the early 60s. He made a number of them. They were based on newspaper photographs in black and white. And they are really quite distressing. This one is called Green Disaster Number 2. In post-war America, the car became a symbol of freedom and opportunity and the pursuit of happiness. And its flip side was the car crash, the existential full stop on life's highway. For America, the car represented liberty and prosperity for the ordinary consumer citizen. But in Warhol's 1960s Death and Disaster screen prints, it took on a much darker aspect. Green Disaster Number 2 bathes the black and white imagery of a newspaper photograph in green and creates this haunting, almost surrealist, I think, scene. The mundane world of suburban affluence is repeatedly shattered by tragedies striking ordinary people. Warhol is acutely aware of the fragility of life, and that's reflected in the very shallow photographic realism of these silk screens. In the repetition of these images, Warhol both abstracts the reality of death to the point of desensitizing the viewer, and simultaneously seems to hammer that image into the viewer's mind. You can't get away from it. They're nightmarish, they're banal, they take on a quality of inevitability. The limp body in the crumpled car might be anybody. Horrific accidents happen, they're commonplace, everybody will die. The hedonistic American dream is no more proof against death than the great possessions, which Kohelet talks about in chapter 2, verse 7. And as he discovered, all is still vanity, and the wise and the foolish share the same fate. It's an observation which, in the absence of any deeper meaning, both supports the pursuit of pleasure and undermines it. There's nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil, says Kohelet. But there's also nothing to be gained under the sun, and one fate comes to everybody. Neither in Kohelet's philosophizing, nor in Andy Warhol's very bleak view of 1960s America, can pleasure and possessions answer the great existential questions. And as St. Paul sums it up for us in Corinthians, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So those are three very different images responding to and in conversation with that passage. I want to bring them up together so that you can see them again side by side. They come across very differently, and if I go back to the homepage for this, you'll lose a little bit on the left, but a slightly larger image. When I think about these together, and in conversation with Ecclesiastes, it seems to me that they are having a very similar conversation along similar lines, but from slightly different angles. In his search for insight into the meaning of life, and in the absence of any direct divine revelation, Kohelet decides to test the potential of wisdom and folly and pleasure. And through his experimental philosophy, he seeks to discover meaning by understanding the world around him and identifying what constitutes a good life. When he creates a royal Eden-like garden filled with fruit trees, he's both declaring his kingly power and making a philosophical test of pleasure. From the rulers of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia to Louis XIV of France, a king's green thumb and his ability to develop gardens demonstrated a mastery of nature, symbolized territorial expansion, and expressed the king's virility. Bartolomeo Bimbi's painting of citrus fruit from the Medici Gardens demonstrates the ongoing passion among the ruling elites for creating gardens and cultivating rare species. These exotic havens proclaimed their owners' power while providing a place in which to explore, imaginatively and scientifically, the world and their influence within it. Kohelet's epistemological experiments, his attempts to understand where knowledge and meaning come from, including gardening, resonated with the Renaissance pursuit of knowledge through science and philosophy. Ecclesiastes as a book aligned very well with humanist thinking, which increasingly privileged skepticism and empirical evidence, things that could be tested and demonstrated. But Ecclesiastes tells us that Kohelet came to hate his earthly paradise because it would be inherited by someone else, who, whether he was a wise man or a fool, would be master of all of it, master of everything that Kohelet had achieved. Even dynasties as powerful as the Medici fall, and great wealth, knowledge, and skill, such as is represented by the cultivation of bizarrely shaped citrus fruit, become just another form of vanity. If gardens are one field of exploration, then painting can be another. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? This huge canvas is a testament to a search for meaning that is as personal as Kohelet's was. For Gauguin, the great question of life was, what is our ideal, natural, rational destiny? And his inquiries into religion began with the questions that he inscribes on this painting. He believed that painting was capable of resolving the paradox between feeling and intellect, and he thought that in this work he had transcended the boundaries of conventional representation in painting and brought together the intellectual and the ineffable. But although he believed that he had surpassed other painters in this respect, he wasn't overly humble, Gauguin. He remained, like Kohelet, acutely aware of his mortality. And if this statement of his own beliefs brought satisfaction, he also intended it to be his last, because he planned to commit suicide once he had finished it. Despite the apparently comprehensive view of human life which it attempts, Gauguin's search for understanding through painting and through religious belief didn't provide the answers that he craved. It returned him to the riddle of human life, which Kohelet described as full of pain, vexation, and vanity. His search for a unified system of belief notwithstanding, Gauguin did strenuously assert his own individuality. In contrast, Andy Warhol famously and probably ironically claimed that he wanted everybody to think alike. His remark referred in part to the confrontation between the very capitalist consumerist society epitomized by America in the 1960s and the communism epitomized by Russia. In Russia, Warhol said, people are being forced into being the same. In America, he said, it is happening all by itself. These are comments designed to perpetuate a self-image that was steeped in the commercial and the banal, but his point is arguably both a political and a theological one. His observation of increasing uniformity, whether that's by political repression or by personal choice, undermines the equation of affluence equals freedom, which was the ideological weapon of the USA during the Cold War. It might also be seen as rejecting a contemporary political adoption of the symbolism of light and dark, of good and evil, in a way that was no longer primarily theological, but had actually become consumerist, capitalist in character. In Warhol's hands, the righteous glow of consumerist freedom is very much overturned by the image of the mangled car. His fascination with commodities, with things that were everywhere available, including cars, can also be read as an undermining of the consumerism that produced mass-produced images as a way of expressing our desires and showing them to be inadequate in the face of the reality of suffering and death. I think in Green Disaster number 2, in this silkscreen, the affluence of that individualistic, mobile, automobile generation of Americans is crashing headlong into the meaninglessness that Warhol saw in wealth and the inescapability of death. The corpse in that car could be anybody. The two divergent political systems that he was observing with their divergent value claims were both equally impotent in the face of mortality. So whether driving cars, or cultivating lemons, or building palaces, or jockeying for political supremacy, searching for meaning through hedonism or territory marking seems to lead us to a dead end. And that is exactly what Ecclesiastes tells us. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. We're going to have a chance to have a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or something else that is stimulating and enlivening. I'm going to suggest that we keep any questions for after we've come back. We're going to look at another exhibition with a very different set of images, and I'm happy to take questions before we start that or keep everything to the end as people feel. But first, Darren has very kindly organised wine and coffee in the porch room.
Is that not evidence?
Well, I think it might be, but since we know that it's all vanity and striving after wind, it probably doesn't matter. don't ring a bell.
You see, hedonism has taken over.
It's only a phase.
Well, if you're a go-go, isn't it? I mean, if anybody was hedonistic, it was him, wasn't it? Seriously, so
Yes, let's not dwell on that too much.
he was chasing a rainbow for the whole of his life, probably. But what is interesting about the lemons and things, I mean, there was creativity there, because if they were actually researching a better lemon, it wasn't just a vanity project, was it? That's right. The artists didn't see that side of it, or our critics didn't see that, or what? Or the artists didn't. Yeah, so it wasn't just a sort of ego trip, was it? Yeah, a bit of entrepreneurial Yes, that's right.
I'll come back into the light if no one has to know. If you find me slumped on the foot because a bottle of wine fell in my mouth. No, it's not right.
We'll try to look at the true Jerry saying the artist.
I don't know, do I? Yes?
You speak up.
I can try. Does that come through? Oh, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll make a start so that you're not too late home to your beds. If anyone has a burning question now, then I'm very happy to take questions at this point. Otherwise, we can look at another exhibition and save up all the questions for later, but whichever way you would prefer is fine by me.
Can I ask a boring question?
Wait, hang on, we have two questions. The lady was ahead of you, John.
Oh my word. Do we have to pay to subscribe to
No,
your
it's
webpage?
It is
free.
It's completely...
That's amazing.
It's online, it's accessible, it's free to anybody. There is no paid content. There is no intention of ever having any paid content. It is a gift.
Yeah, my boring question really is on behalf of those of us who preach. If we choose to use some of this material as part of a sermon or to make a
Can
point
you
or
use
whatever,
the image? No.
we can't use it.
No, not from this website. We
Okay.
have the copyright licenses to show these images online in this website. So we can't give the images to anybody else to use for anything else.
So we can't throw it onto a screen and let a public audience...
You can do what I'm doing, which
Yes.
is show it live on Wi-Fi. You can't download a picture
No.
and print it out.
No, so we can use this
But
system.
you can do what I'm doing this evening, absolutely.
That's good to know. Thank you.
And we encourage people to do that. We would be very pleased if people do that.
Yeah. And it advertises the website too, if we show them that much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, well, I hope that you have all enjoyed your moment of hedonism. We're going to turn to a passage in Romans, which is another of our slightly more challenging parts. The Pauline epistles are not known for having inspired a great many artworks directly in a way that you can look at it and say, ah, yes, that is a picture of the epistle to the Romans. This doesn't really happen in artistic terms. So when we're addressing the epistles, as with something like Ecclesiastes or the wisdom literature, we have to think a bit more laterally. Now, in the Ecclesiastes exhibition that we've just looked at, I showed you 3 very different artworks. We had quite a span of times, periods, and places. The exhibition I'm showing you now, which is for Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 39, takes a much more condensed approach geographically and temporally. We've got 3 Renaissance works, 2 of which are oil on canvas, 1 of which is a fresco directly onto a wall, but all from a much closer period intellectually and artistically. Again, you have the biblical passage on your handout sheet, and I'm going to start by reading it. You'll be pleased to know that it's much shorter. So this is Romans 8, 18 to 39. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in travail together until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as sons, for the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts of men knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. We know that in everything God works for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to this? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all,
will he not also give us all things with him? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? It is Christ Jesus who died, yes, who was raised from the dead, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed intercedes for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are being killed all day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. So a very well-known passage, a very dearly loved passage, a passage on which a great deal of theological ink has been expended. Not a terribly visual passage, one might think. The first painting which I've chosen for this exhibition is by Vittore Carpaccio, and it was painted in the late 15th century. It's called nowadays, in terms of an exhibition, of a gallery title, the kind of thing that you get on a window, on a label on a wall, sorry. It's called The Meditation on Passion. It could be called many other things, but I think it's as good as a name as any, and it's now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it's a very strange and mysterious image. It's not an obvious narrative moment in the Passion. You have Jesus here, evidently dead, his head slumped onto the side. You can see the wounds in his hands and just about in his feet. There's the crown of thorns at the bottom. And he's sitting on this ruined marble throne in an extraordinary, slightly surreal landscape. To his left, to the left, to his right, is Saint Jerome, an ascetic saint, someone we might expect to find in the desert. And we could also know that it's Jerome because he has his friendly lion with him, whom you very often see in depictions of Jerome. On the right of the picture, on Christ's left, is another ascetic, even more gaunt, even less clothed. Quite hard to identify unless you happen to be able to read the inscription on the block that he's sitting on and have done a certain amount of detective work involving another painting by Carpaccio. And I won't go into the complicated details of that, but essentially it was possible to understand that this is Job from the Old Testament. In his shorter commentary on Romans 8, and it's not all that short, Karl Barth describes a state of existence in which humanity has been judged and put to death on the cross, and yet in which the fear of death has been removed because it has already taken place in Christ, and we no longer have to endure it. This is, in Barth's words, life under the shadow of the cross, but that shadow is also, he says, the herald of the glory that awaits us. Vittore Carpaccio's meditation on the Passion might give us some sense of this mixture of fatal condemnation and ultimate hope. Death is certainly very prominent here. The figure of the dead Christ slumped on this ruinous throne in a dusty, bone-strewn foreground. We can see the crown of thorns and these very sharp lance-like shadows on the ground, which are reminders of the Passion.
combining aspects of an image known as the Man of Sorrows, with the dead Christ, his head slumped, emphasizing his suffering, and an image type known as Christ on the cold stone, which is not dissimilar, but also of Christ enthroned. This Christ is accompanied not by the supporting angels or the mourning virgin or the lamenting disciples, but by Job and Jerome. The beleaguered prophet and this 4th century very ascetic saint, the translator of the Bible and indeed author of a commentary on Job, provide a counterweight to what Barth called the inexorable fatality of the shadow of the cross. The crumbling marble block on which Job sits is inscribed with some of his most celebrated words, "My Redeemer lives," from Job 19. So Job, the great sufferer, proffers the hope of the resurrection and points towards the viewers as if to indicate that Christ's death is for them, while Jerome's gaze is looking outwards, reinforcing that connection. The shadow of death in Carpaccio's painting is not permanent, and we have Job and Jerome to testify to the coming glory. The second painting that I wanted to think about in connection with this passage is this Annunciation from the Dominican Friary of San Marco in Florence. And those of you who were here a couple of weeks ago will have seen another Annunciation from that house. It's on the wall of one of the friar's cells and looks very much like the architecture of the cell itself, so that it seems to become part of the building. In verse 28 of Romans 8, Paul speaks of a collaboration between God and those who are called according to his purpose, and of how they will be conformed to the image of Christ. A calling or vocation to serve God and to be conformed to Christ was central to the Dominican brothers, for whom Fra Angelico painted this Annunciation in the 1440s. It's one of many frescoes which punctuate the architecture of the House of San Marco, where the artist himself was a friar and later the prior. And these paintings intersected with the friars' daily lives at every point. They were intended to facilitate the conformity of each individual to the community as a whole and ultimately to Christ. Most of them include a Dominican as an example whom the friars were encouraged to imitate. Often it's St. Dominic, who modelled himself on Christ, or the Virgin, who was nominally the abbess of the Dominican order. And here it is St. Peter Martyr, whose head you can see is bleeding from the wound which was inflicted on him by the heretics who killed him. He is one of the slaughtered sheep to whom Paul refers. The friars learned from these examples the proper response to the images in front of them, often through particular physical attitudes and gestures which were associated with particular states of prayer. And Peter Martyr here appears in what was understood as a meditative mode of prayer, suited to preparations for preaching. So he's not anachronistically present at the Annunciation, so much as contemplating it, just as the friar who saw it would be doing, and seeking to understand it in such a way that he can respond to it through his preaching and his behaviour. The greatest example of vocation was, of course, supplied by the Virgin Mary herself, and we see her here accepting the call to be the mother of God's Son. Her room in this fresco directly reflects the architecture of the friar's cell, and her presence would have served as a constant reminder to him of the humility and glory of her vocation. And our third image is by an artist called Jacopo Bassano. It's mid-16th century. You can see it hanging on the walls of the National Gallery in London. And we are looking at Jesus stumbling on the way to Calvary, and Saint Veronica, the legendary Saint Veronica, holding out her veil to him to wipe the sweat from his face. You can see the cross that he's carrying here, and these soldiers. Maybe easier if I use the pointer. The Virgin Mary is here wiping her tears. The other women who have come along with her here. Bassano is showing us this moment when Veronica offers Christ her veil to wipe his face, and he leaves his portrait imprinted on the cloth. This came to be known as the Veronica, vera icona, the true image, and it was considered to be an authentic image of Christ. It's a very important part of the development of Christian imagery of how Christ looked. But in this painting, we see not the portrait, but Christ himself, and perhaps even more arrestingly, Saint Veronica taking on his likeness. On her knees in the road, her posture reflects Christ's, and her bare head, you'll notice that the other women are all discreetly veiled and looking downcast. Her bare head shows her crown of plaits, echoing his crown of thorns. Her mirroring of Christ is further revealed by her clothing. I'm going to show you a detail here of her petticoat, which is stitched together, leaving these almond-shaped openings, which prefigure, if you like, the shape of the wound in Christ's side. And the vertical stitch marks along the sides, which might remind us of the marks of flagellation that are hidden beneath Christ's robe. As he is being led by a rope round his neck and round his waist like a sheep to slaughter, in St. Paul's words, Veronica is alongside him in tribulation, distress, persecution, and peril. And her hair and her garments, her feminine attributes, manifest this. In part, this is a picture about picture making and the legendary origins of a foundational image of the adult Christ. It's also about a particular incidence of what one might now call Christian witness, or perhaps, since Veronica is in a sense an image maker, we might call it artist witness. Her offering of her veil here is as much an offering of herself in conformity to Christ. And if she's not yet bodily redeemed, as Paul says in verse 23, she is about to be blessed with the imprint on the veil, which cannot yet be seen, but will become a source of hope and consolation to many. And if we think about those three works side by side, and about what Paul is writing to the church in Rome in that letter, Paul tells us that the sufferings of creation are anticipatory, that its groans are labour pains, that there is a glorious salvation coming. For Paul, Christ is a second Adam who makes possible the renewal of the creation which the first Adam's sin had subjected to this bondage of corruption, to what Barth calls dust and oblivion. References to suffering and to a sense of decay are certainly ubiquitous in Vittore Carpaccio's Meditation on the Passion. Bones, wounds, weeds, collapsing masonry, the things that we see in the foreground, and a skull like the skull of Adam, which is often depicted at the foot of the cross. These are particularly prominent. The landscape on the left
is craggy and rather cavernous. It's got this one bare tree, and there are ravaging animals attacking each other. You can see a leopard catching a deer here. We have Jerome with his hand on his chest, reminding us, if I can get back to him. Sorry. Where are you hiding, Jerome? Holding his hand to his chest, reminding us of how often he's depicted with a stone beating his breast in penitence. This is a penitential wilderness. It's the sort of place that people retreated in order to perform acts of penance, to meditate, to live extremely ascetic lives. And it's here that Jerome and Job are waiting for the redemption of our bodies, for the fulfillment of Job's testimony that his Redeemer lives, and that after his death he will nevertheless, and in his flesh, see God. Despite the groans of creation, Paul views this period of waiting for renewal as a time of hope, sustained by the Spirit, as he says in verse 26, and he reflects on the role of God's human creatures in furthering divine purposes. Jacopo Bassano's Saint Veronica gives us one way of imagining how that might be possible. She is showing us a particular instance of conforming herself to the image of the Son. We can't see the future portrait of Christ which will be imprinted on her veil, but we can see her own conformity to him. Her posture, her hair, her clothing all mirror his posture, his clothing, his hair, as she voluntarily shares in his degradation. For the Dominican friars of San Marco, conformity to Christ was an aspiration which guided every aspect of their lives. And as they sought to model their behaviour and their spiritual development on that of their saintly role models, Fra Angelico's frescoes were there to provide instruction and inspiration. Paul knows that conformity to Christ will not come easily. But despite the trials and tribulations, the peril and the persecutions that he talks about, he confidently reassures his readers that nothing can separate them from the love of God. Job bore the sufferings that were inflicted on him with patience. Jerome chose ascetic hardship as a spiritual practice that would bring him closer to Christ. Veronica responded to Christ's suffering in humility and vulnerability as an uncovered woman kneeling in the dirt amongst the soldiers. And the friars of San Marco tried to imitate the saintly examples of suffering, such as the bleeding St. Peter Martyr or St. Dominic weeping at the foot of the cross in a fresco in their cloister. Whether we take Paul's translated words in verses 37 to 39 at face value, or whether we literally picture a world threatened by the devilish forces and beings that he might have been referring to, the certainty with which Paul dismisses any possibility of separation from God's love echoes through these paintings. Neither death nor life can separate Job and Jerome from the redemption which they can't yet see, but which seems to be prefigured in the landscape behind Job. And I just want to go back to that and show you how the landscape on the right is transformed compared to that rather barren wilderness on the left. Here you have fields and greenery and lakes and towns and some wonderful, prosperous-looking little people in the middle, some of them with horses, and a leopard and a deer who seem to be wandering along quite happily together. The powers which condemned Christ to that long walk to Calvary don't separate St. Veronica from him. On the contrary, it's in that context that she comes closest to God's love and is most transformed by her own participation in God's purposes. And neither the things present, the socially unacceptable and apparently impossible circumstances of the Virgin's pregnancy, nor the excruciating pain of the things to come that she will suffer, the things which attend her vocation as God's mother, can separate her from that love of God. Paul says in verse 37 that separation from God is conquered in Christ. It is conquered in these paintings, in the willingness of Mary, kneeling at prayer in a room which is barely distinguishable from a friar's cell, in the tearing of the temple curtain, which we read about in Matthew 27, which had separated man and God, and which is echoed in those punctures in Veronica's clothes. And it's conquered in the luminous, empty space between the Virgin and the angel, which indicates the mystery of the Incarnation, in which virginity is no barrier to Christ's conception. So I'm going to leave you with that very white space, very light space in the middle, and suggest that if you're not all drunk on wine and stupefied by pictures, that we might have questions. Darren, do we have a stick mic? Thank you. Some people were cheating by asking me questions over wine and coffee.
You've been talking, Chloe, about the symbolism of so much and what it indicates. You haven't said too much about colour, and I notice in that last image with Fra Angelica that the Blessed Virgin is wearing very similar colour to the angel. She's depicted in medieval red and sometimes in blue, and you would say that blue was because it was lapis lazuli and it was an expensive pigment, etc., etc. But she is usually depicted in red. There are very similar colours there. Does one read, am I reading too much into it, that there's a likeness between her and her closeness to God by virtue of her colour being similar to the angels, or am I reading too much into it, or am I allowed to think what I like about that sort of thing?
I think you're allowed to think what you like. I don't know why she isn't depicted in blue here. She is in many other places in the same friary. The Annunciation in the corridor has her in blue. There's an enthroned Virgin and Child with saints where she's in blue. She's in a number of the individual friars' cells in blue, or sometimes in a kind of purpley colour. But this, I think, is very unusual. I haven't come across anything in the literature that specifically discusses this colour, but I think it is very striking that not only is she wearing extremely similar garments of extremely similar colours, but she is also sort of moulding herself to that arch shape of the building that she's in, as the angel is. You have those two sweeping curves going up and going up, and this space in the middle. And to my mind, they are framing that space of possible, impossible, that mysterious wall that you can't see beyond. But I think it's entirely reasonable to think of it in terms of her proximity to heaven, and therefore her proximity to the heavenly messenger. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. It's been brilliant. I'm guessing that you've had to select 3 pieces of art for each of these exhibitions, and you must have looked at a very large number in order to select those three. That sounds like an extraordinary task, and I just wonder what criteria you were using to make your selections, and also in the ones you've just been showing us recently, we haven't seen any more modern pieces of art, but we did earlier this evening. I just wondered how you saw the value of these masterpieces in relation to the more modern pieces that are around.
I think that was a number of questions in one, so I'll try and take them bit by bit. It can be very difficult to select the artworks, and some of our authors will ask for help with that. Sometimes people already have an idea of what they might want to use. Often people will have two artworks that they know they want to discuss in relation to their passage, but they might be struggling for a third one, or they might feel that the three they've chosen are perhaps too similar and they want something different. And we will try to help them to find alternative possibilities, things that might enrich the exhibition as a whole. Personally, I find that I've come at things from quite different angles depending on the exhibition that I'm working on. With this passage, I knew all three of those paintings very well and had written about them in other contexts. And as I was reading the Romans passage, they were the things that came into my mind, and I felt this is a conversation I would like to have with them. And it was a relatively easy process. With Ecclesiastes, it took me absolutely ages to decide what I wanted to use because there were so many possibilities. And as I said, I wasn't going to find a straightforward illustration that would work. And often I don't find that that's the most interesting way to approach the exhibitions anyway. But there was no question of that. So I spent a lot longer reading and thinking about the themes that were coming through in that passage and looking at commentaries on it and thinking about the theology of it and what the actual biblical text is saying in a lot of detail, and Ecclesiastes was not something I'd particularly worked on before. And then as particular themes emerged, I started looking for works of art that I felt spoke to those. But it was quite a slow process. I can't remember how many months it took me to find those three and think, yes, that will work together. It also varies depending on the expertise of our authors. So sometimes we'll have somebody commissioned for a particular exhibition because they are the expert on that passage. And they already know, every artwork there is going about it. And it will be relatively easy for them in that respect to choose ones that they find most relevant. Sometimes we commission an author because we know that that author will do a wonderful job with a passage that they may not be hugely familiar with, and that they will be able to think truly theologically and constructively and find other things that will work with it. So it really depends. And in terms of the variety of the images, I think we've got a reasonably good mixture of modern and contemporary works and older works. We are always encouraging people to move towards a mixture and to bring in more modern and contemporary things. We're very keen to have a more globally diverse range of artworks, and that, I'm pleased to say, is building up. It can be difficult sometimes because access to museum collections in other parts of the world isn't always as easy as it is in Europe and North America, and because things that might be in private collections or in churches are often harder to get hold of. Some contemporary works can also be really difficult to get. When you're dealing with, something from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, it's very easy to get image rights because they're set up to expect people to want to use that. They want to license their images. They have a department that deals with it. It's something they do all the time. Smaller collections, and particularly contemporary artists, can be far more complicated. They may be bemused by the request sometimes. Contemporary artists may want to know what's going to be written about their artwork before they give permission,
They may want to see a complete mock-up of what the exhibition will look like, what other artworks it's going to be alongside. And they might then say, actually, no, that's not how I would curate my own work. I don't want it in that context. And then we have to start from scratch. And sometimes you're then having to deal with an artist's agent or a gallery as well as the artists themselves. And that can be a complex process. So it varies hugely. In terms of the value of old masterpieces and more modern and contemporary works, I can understand the question, but I don't think many of our authors would think like that. I don't think that's a question that usually arises. The question is, what will be a generative conversation partner here? And sometimes people need to be encouraged to think of having that conversation with a work of art they might not have immediately brought to mind. A bit like an academic conference or a symposium, I suppose. Sometimes you need to invite speakers who aren't the people you actually know already, but might be the expert in that subject. When you're living in a new place, you may need to go and meet the people that you didn't necessarily meet at your usual activities. So sometimes there's that kind of encouragement involved. But I don't think there's a lot of, we value this more than that. We do have a quality control system, and if we think somebody has chosen an artwork which simply does not speak and does not have anything, relevant, resonant, interesting to say, then we will say, no, you can't have that particular artwork. We don't think it's good enough in that sense. We don't think it's theologically generative. And that can be a difficult conversation at times. Much harder, of course, where it's a contemporary artist, because you may have sensibilities involved. But it doesn't pose too much of a problem very often. I'm trying to think if there was another part to your question which I've missed, or whether I've caught up on all of it. Nope, that was covered. Okay, thank you. Yes, Darren, we've got a question at the front. Can you break round? Sorry, thank you.
Have you considered, or would you consider, using the Last Supper sculpture there as an illustration of some topic that you're using? Do you look out when if you're going around galleries or churches or whatever? Do you ever come across a particular work of art that you think might be useful in illustrating something and pursue it?
We have quite a number of examples of artworks from churches, some contemporary, some installations which are not there permanently, and many that are permanent works within buildings. And they've been written about in interesting, exciting ways. Stained glass often falls into that category because it is very often still in its building. I wouldn't personally have anything particularly useful or interesting to say about the Last Supper that we've currently got in the Lady Chapel, and I've been rather hoping that nobody would ask me about it. But we do use lots of contemporary artworks and works from churches, yes.
You said earlier on that you were hoping to expand the website to include the whole Bible. Mm-hmm. Would it be interesting to know how you curate some of the bits like the genealogies or the more repetitive bits of Leviticus?
Yes. Within our team, we talk about it as a Toblerone. There are peaks, which everybody wants to write about and everybody wants to read about, and troughs, which do not feel quite as exciting. And we have a number of ways of dealing with that. Sometimes those troughs are troughs because they are repetitive. They may be repeating something that's covered in another book of the Bible, in which case we can put them together and they become more interesting than repeating the thing we've already done. Sometimes they're troughs because they're repetitive within themselves, and it can feel difficult to find something useful to say about that. And sometimes they are troughs because they deal with things that we find it very difficult to think about now. Quite a chunk of Leviticus, I think, falls into that category. People don't necessarily want to focus on it a huge amount. We've been looking at various ways of dealing with that. Sometimes we find an author who can do something really interesting by thinking laterally with what this passage is about and why it's still there in the Bible. And we are taking the whole of the canonical text and the Apocrypha, and we have said, all of this is scripture, we will cover the lot. So we have to take each bit seriously. There are passages where we make the section being dealt with longer. There are some things where a whole book may be an exhibition, and we might well do that with some of the shorter epistles. We're looking at perhaps doing Titus as one exhibition, because it is making a fairly small number of points within that letter. There doesn't seem a great deal of value in chunking that up into small bits. Similarly, with some of the Old Testament books, we give longer passages in order to have more for the author to work with. But yeah, it can be difficult. Thank you. Anybody else? Claire's got a question.
Chloe, I can't imagine. There's so many works of art, and how you actually begin when you look at a particular passage to think of which particular things you're going to be doing. You must have an enormous knowledge of what works of art are.
Well, I'm not sure that I have an enormous knowledge, but I think across all of our author curators and the staff team, between us, we have quite a large amount of artworks in mind. And we also work with a picture researcher who can help if something is proving particularly difficult, and who is very familiar with a lot of museum collections and works in public ownership and works still in churches. And she's often very good at saying, well, if this isn't quite working, what about that? So between us, we cover quite a lot of ground. What I think we're not yet good enough at is our familiarity with some of the work that isn't in European and North American collections, which can just be much harder to find. It tends to be less available online, it tends to be less published, and unless you happen to be living, working, or visiting those parts of the world, then it can be much harder to know about them. And so we're always very keen when we have authors who can bring images that our readers and our viewers won't necessarily know and that we might not be familiar with. I had a student yesterday at King's who showed me some frescoes from a church in Civitavecchia in Italy of Japanese martyrs from Nagasaki in the 1500s. Now, I think as a team between us, we thought we were pretty good on Italian churches, and my art historian colleague, who's the deputy director of the project, is certainly very good on Italian churches. None of us had ever seen them before. So that was very exciting, and we would like to have a lot more of that. Anybody else? Oh, yes?
Sorry, can I be heard by...
I can hear you.
Yes, I'm always concerned that I've got too close, too far away. I must say, after your first presentation, along with Philip, my wife and I, who've been married for 57 years, have never had such a long discussion about what we interpreted from what you have both told us. I came away with a key word to me, which was mammon. I don't know what your interpretation of the word mammon might be. And this evening, the word vanity has been very strong. May I ask, if we look at our 14th century pictures, They didn't have television in society. I wonder how many people of population, across the population, had a chance of seeing such pictures. But did such art bring people to faith?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, largely because we don't have the kind of historical records that would make it possible to know that. There are accounts of people who prayed with miraculous images and who had conversion-like experiences with those images. So people who had maybe gone to repent of a sin or to pray for a particular thing and had a very powerful religious experience in that process because of the work of art that they were using as a focus for their prayer. So
that would have to really be at the point of worship, though, wouldn't it? Because the hoi polloi
yes.
could not afford such.
Well, it depends, because not the works that I've been showing you today, but many artworks were in the public sphere.
Right.
They could be seen in churches, they could be seen in public squares, on the streets.
Yes.
There would be statues and images on the corners of buildings, even for people who did not own a work of art of their own, or who did not go into wealthy households that owned them. They would have had access to quite a lot of artworks in the public domain.
So therefore, if I may comment then, that would have been a degree of visual entertainment for them as well. Whereas now, with television and all the other media processes for providing information, how much does art, such as you are presenting, bring people to faith?
In the contemporary world, again, I don't know. I don't think we have the data for that. In historic times, I think it's important to remember that not having faith would have been a very peculiar thing. People were in a Christian society. If you think of these Renaissance artworks, atheism isn't really an option. There would be people whose faith was deeper or less deep, better articulated or less well articulated, more fervently practiced or more negligently practiced. But the idea of coming to faith is less applicable, and a conversion type experience would be more likely to be to do with a way of life or a relationship with a particular saint or a particular way of knowing God.
So therefore, Warhol now represents what folk would more easily recognise as significant things in life. A smashed up car, a can of Coke, the images, the focus on for the hoi polloi is quite different.
Well, they might do. Warhol was a devout Catholic, despite his lifestyle. So I think it's always worth looking at his artwork with a degree of a theological lens on it, because he understands how images and faith can work together or in opposition. He is obviously the artist of the consumerist and the banal and the replicable. But he was also a man whose faith was very important to him and who was very much shaped by his Catholicism. So that's an interesting one.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you again. Yeah. Very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, to go back to something you said earlier, I think the question is perhaps less one of bringing people to faith with the older artworks that we've looked at, and more a question of how that visual imagery shaped the nature of their faith, what kind of faith identity it made possible or didn't make possible. I suspect, Darren, that at the dizzy hour of 10:15, we should all clear out and let you go to bed. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Do remember that this is a fundraiser for our beautiful windows and organ, and please give generously. And it's a pleasure to see some people here and to know that there are other people watching on the internet. It will be available on YouTube, I think, from tomorrow, perhaps, Darren? I don't know. Soon. So if there are people whom you know wanted to come and couldn't, then do encourage them to look it up on the YouTube channel. Thank you.
And in Howard's absence, can I, on your behalf, say a very big thank you to Chloe. You opened a whole new door to us tonight, and not only what we've seen tonight, but we can go home and explore this marvellous website that you've obviously worked so hard to help put together. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. That you can go and look at.
And as to the future, I know that Howard has got other evenings similar to this in mind. I don't think we've got any dates yet, but I know that one on music and faith is being worked upon. So I'm sure you will see the publicity for that in due course. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerald.